Beginning a new unit today, and we're going to start looking at consumer behavior. Previously, we looked at a lot of different ways that we collect information about consumers. This one's going to be more about how we apply that information, which means now we understand what consumers want, um, what products they prefer to others. We're going to try to look at there's a consumer behavior model. So we want to understand why do they make decisions, why do they prefer one product over another, and then instead of just collecting empirical information, but have kind of a theoretical model to understand consumer behavior. So let's start with just a roadmap of what we're going to be doing in this video lecture. The first is we're going to go over what's called the stimulus response model consumer behavior. So the idea here is that when we market, when we put an advertisement out there to the public, we are creating a stimulus. And there's a bunch of environments, there's a bunch of bouncing balls of consumers out there, and all of a sudden we kind of throw something into that environment, an ad, and that stimulus is going to lead to a response. If we're successful, that response should be a purchase of the product we're trying to market, but also in the process of creating a relationship and building value between the product and the consumer. The second thing we're going to do is talk about the buyer decision process, which means how does a buyer, a consumer, decide about purchasing one product versus another? First, they have to understand that they need a product, they want a product, then they're going to have to look at alternatives. Then they're going to purchase the product, but that doesn't end the process. And we're going to talk a little bit about the post-purchase process and why that's important, particularly when we talk about an concept called cognitive dissonance, which is that one common thing is that many people regret purchasing things after they complete the purchase, and this affects their long-term, let's say, consumer behavior toward a particular firm or a particular product line. And lastly, we're going to look at the production adoption process, which means how does a product go from having a few early adopters, meaning some consumers buy it before others? This is very common with new technology products. Until that you see almost everyone adopt the product. To the point is then people move out of the old product into, let's say, an alternative. So you might have gone from, let's say, landline phones to cordless phones to cell phones to smartphones to tablets or whatever people will be using next. So that being said, let's get started into part of this. So let's start with defining consumer buyer behavior. So basically, behavior are actions. And the buying behavior of individuals and households who buy our goods and services is what we're trying to understand. The behavior we're trying to understand is the purchase or non-purchase of a particular good or service. The thing is that we have different stages in this. So usually we have the end consumer, the one who's going to own the product or require the service. But however, usually what's happened is you have a manufacturer and they're going to sell to a wholesaler, and the wholesaler is going to sell to a retailer, and then the retailer eventually is the one making the sale to the consumer. But generally, the advertisement is not by the end retailer, it's usually by the manufacturer or the person who owns the product. So the point is that there's a lot of steps in between, and you have to influence all the steps. So for example, before a consumer can actually buy my product, it has to be in the stores and available to them, which means I have to convince a wholesaler or retailer that they want to carry my product. So for example, one of the former students has a biscotti making company, and one of the hardest things is not, there's a lot of people who like his products, he's done samples for, who would buy his coffee biscuits if they were available. But the hardest thing he had to do was make the various delis and restaurants carry his coffee biscuits first. So the point about this, though, we're talking mostly about the final consumer, which means how do we get the buying public, the end consumer, like you or I, to actually want the product and maybe put pressure on the retailer and the wholesaler to contact the manufacturer and stock their product. So I'm sorry, I was probably not very clear there, but what I was trying to get at is that you might think of it as the manufacturer sells to the wholesaler, and the wholesaler then leans on the retailer, and the retailer leans on the consumer to get the behavior. But what might more likely and more commonly happens is that you have an established product, and the manufacturer or the owner of the company indirectly tries to appeal to the end consumer, and then has the consumer put pressure on the retailer put pressure on the wholesaler, and the wholesaler then making the purchase from the original manufacturer. Which means that if we get people to demand our product, that might be more effective than, let's say, in a sense, creating like a sale down through the wholesaler retailer to the consumer. So how do consumers respond to various marketing efforts? So we have a lot of different ways to advertise. We have television advertisements, we have social media advertisements, we have word of mouth. and how do they respond to various efforts to influence them. And a lot of this research comes from actually political research on how to influence voters to support one political party or another. And people have gone through a lot of different things about what actually changes people's behavior. Um, we'll get to that a little bit later, but that's kind of the question that we're asking. But rather than in trying to understand how voters decide, we're trying to understand how buyers decide. And if we think of voters as a type of consumer who are buying political, one party or the other, one product, the product offered by one party or the other, a lot of the things translate from one sphere to the so this is kind of a diagram illustrating the stimulus response model. And so the buyer is treated as like a black box, that the buyer has various characteristics, demographics, the buyer has a decision process that we'll get into later, and there's an environment that these things go on. So you have an economic environment, technological environment, social cultural environment. We've gone over this in previous units, so I'm not going to go much in detail here, but the point is that there are different subcultures, classes, technologies, economics that can, let's say, are the milieu or the environment that surrounds the consumer and can, let's say, involve them. What the marketing, the stimuli are, the 4 Ps that we've talked about previously as well. Different types of products. We can change the price. We can advertise or promote it in different places. And then we can have a variety of different gimmicks or promotions like buy one, get one free. And hopefully that kind of gets the buyer to make the decision to purchase the product. So what can we influence on the buyer? We can, obviously we can actually have them make a purchase. And that's one type of behavior. But it can be what the buyer buys, the product itself, but also can be where they're going to buy it from. One thing that's happening, and it's becoming clear in, let's say, the coronavirus world that we're living in, is that with food, is that not all food is sold to grocery stores. So even though there's a lot of food being made, you're seeing that some agricultural companies, farmers, etc., are just getting rid of food while there's a need for food because they typically sold not to grocery stores but to restaurants. And because restaurants aren't purchasing and the products they're making don't have barcodes or the ability to track and ship and get into the grocery store market, they're not able to sell them. So where a buyer buys something is a key thing. So we also did this in our water project, which is that if you have a high-end water product, you might only sell it in restaurants or exclusive locations, or you can buy it, let's say, in a store or a convenience. And so it's not just are they going to buy your product, it's when and where they're going to buy your product, and sometimes whether they're going to buy a lot of your product or a little. So things like bulk sales, etc. The other one is kind of maybe an overall view, which means you might not get them to buy your particular product, but you might be able to convince them about the necessity of your product. Once again, we talked about this on the water project, which is that what water companies had to do was convince people that you wanted to spend something 500, 1,000% markup for something that you could get free and probably of the same quality. And people had to convince people that, let's say, tap water was somehow tainted or dirty or polluted or whatever. And so what they did is they changed consumers by making them more worried about the quality of, let's say, municipal water. And that kind of created a push not to buy their particular water product, but to buy bottled water or other types of water products. And so those are types of things that you might get them to do that are not necessarily strictly about, here's an ad, buy my product. There's some other things you might want to influence about the buyer and their environment and their process. So we've talked about a lot of these different things. There's a lot of different things that can influence their behavior. So we've talked about culture before. Different products are aligned with different culture or subcultures or social classes. Whether it's different ethnic groups, whether it's different economic groups, those can be things. Another one is kind of the social environment, which means who is buying, who's making the purchase decisions in the family. Stereotypically in the past is that most technology decisions were made by the father of the family. So buying a new TV or a new sound system or computer, the final decision was usually made by the father, and therefore most of the advertising and marketing and for technology was aimed at the male breadwinner or the father figure in the household, while many family products or food products were, decisions were made by the mother, and therefore a lot of advertising for those products were targeted at the mother. And so the point is, depending on who has what role in the family, who's earning the money, who's making the decisions in the money, making decisions in the family about what to purchase, can kind of influence the advertising. Another one is about reference groups, which just like what do people compare themselves to. So the idea is that if you see one group buying a certain product to keep up with the Joneses, and if that Joneses are your reference group, you're going to buy that product too. Personal, which means people buy things in different stages of their lifestyle. When people are young, they purchase a lot of education and toys and other things of that sort. When they're older, they purchase a lot of, let's say, pharmaceuticals. Different jobs, occupations, teachers. So, like, for example, it's not so important for a teacher to have a luxury car, but it might be very important for a real estate agent to have a luxury car because you're trying to communicate success and a certain type of coolness, which might not be required for one occupation versus another. But the point is, all these things can classify or define different types of buyers. And so, as we learn and get all this information through marketing and research, we can decide, what are the pathways or what are the channels that we can approach the buyer for. So, culture is kind of, let's say, the program, the thing that's passed on generation to generation. And very often we equate culture with like a nationality or an ethnic group. Like there's an American culture, there's a French culture, there's a Japanese culture. We often think of it in terms of like modern nations, but culture doesn't have to be just a national group. It can be subgroups within a nation. Arguably, there are more than one culture within the United States. And because you're not trying to make a political point as a marketer, you're trying to understand what these different cultures are and how they kind of create the basic menu of choices that individual buyers are going to have. So we pick up culture through a variety of different social institutions, religion, educational, family, peers, work environments. So we pick up these cultures like from different people. So I'll give you one example: Oakley glasses, which is no longer a product, but was kind of a type of sunglasses that was very popular among first responders, meaning police officers, ambulance, volunteer ambulance, things of that sort. And so if you were part of that, and there were a lot of different people, from people who are professors at universities to people who are nursing assistants, etc. So a whole gamut, various different ethnic groups, but they all wore Oakley glasses because their one common institution was a first responder agency. And as a result, they kind of picked that up as, let's say, a buying priority. So a variety of different things. So very often you dress like other people in your profession dress. So if you're a teacher, you tend to buy and shop at the places that other teachers buy and shop. And you don't dress, you probably very few overdress, meaning they are fashionistas, but very few underdress as well. What the culture gives you is some basic values, perceptions, behavior. One of the ones that was pointed out to me, and this is from my experience in Japan, is wrapping. Japanese generally will not buy something that is not wrapped well. So if you buy something in a Japanese store, you'll probably find 4 or 5 layers of wrapping, which means not just, let's say, a paper or a box, but there'll be a plastic container over the paper, over the box, in a bag, with tissue paper, etc. They are very good at wrapping things like breakables or things of that sort. They're very good at tying everything up. So very often in a Japanese store, there are very few bags, but they will be able to make a bag kind of origami style out of a piece of paper and then tie it up. Because that's considered part of the process, and some things that are not well wrapped or not well packaged will get rejected. And you find this very often with some American products, because Americans generally don't really prioritize packaging as much, or packaging is functional, not aesthetic, and as a result, American products don't sell that well in Japan. A good example of this is McDonald's, which exists in Japan and the United States. In the United States, you get a burger and it's wrapped and it's usually smushed, and it's wrapped tight and closed so that it doesn't leak out. In Japan, when they wrap something, there's no pressing, because the idea that anything is distorted or anything is mushed makes it inedible in their eyes. And that's something that comes from a value that's derived from their culture. So sometimes culture shifts, usually generationally, sometimes because certain events. Someone was saying that 20 years from now, after this pandemic, those of us who have gone through this pandemic are probably going to be really good hand washers and probably really put an emphasis on personal hygiene. Children who've never experienced this, that were after the vaccine, et cetera, are not going to understand why we take cleanliness so seriously because they didn't have the same experience. Similarly, people who grew up in the Great Depression tend to save a lot of money and tend to always emphasize the value, which means they love like coupons and they love saving 20 cents, not because they need the money per se, but because they grew up in an environment of poverty and scarcity, and therefore they love the idea of saving money, even if it's small amounts of money, while a later, more affluent generation just says, look, it's not worth saving 20 cents. I just want to get this transaction done quickly. So within cultures, you often have subcultures, which means there isn't maybe one American culture. There are probably different ethnic groups, different regional groups, Northeast versus Southern versus West Coast. But even within those, there can be subcultures, which means things that are held by a group of people that are maybe different than, let's say, what is shared from the overall society or is derivative. So, for example, Americans, regardless of their political persuasion, like the idea of freedom. But if you're a conservative, freedom tends to talk about economic freedom and maybe freedom, Second Amendment. But freedom for people on the left of the political spectrum might have something more to do with the idea of choice, freedom, restrictions, liberation for a variety of different groups. And so the basis of subcultures could be an ethnic, but it also could be a religious group. It could just be even a geographic region. So how you would sell something in the Northeast or the West Coast is different than how you might sell something in the South. So some major subculture groups, and you can see this in terms of this cover girl. I believe this is Queen Latifah. Cover girl generally very often was a white female celebrity, often very, and I'm teaching adolescent psychology, and we talked about how some types of models emphasize thinness and whiteness and kind of almost emaciated look. And what you're seeing more for cosmetics, things of that sort, you're seeing them making appeals not to one assumed majority culture, usually white, suburban, affluent. You're seeing them making appeals to various ethnic groups, African Americans, Hispanics, Asian Americans, particularly as these groups become larger, but not just become larger, but also these groups become more affluent, which means there's more demand backing on that. There's not just a desire out there, there's a desire backed by money, and you're seeing marketing and various different firms responding to that. So a second way that can be is social class, and social class is not the same as culture, although sometimes it can overlap. Social class is basically this idea, the idea of belonging to different groups. So there are a lot of different talk about what constitutes a class. It could be a class is just wealthy, having certain resources, and other people not having those resources. But very often it's more about aspirations, which means college students are relatively poor by if you judge them by their income, the cars they drive, where they live, etc. But they usually many college students have aspirations to be a lot wealthier in the future, or have a white-collar job, or not work with their hands. While, let's say, people who do not go to college but go into certain trades, who make a lot more money than college students, who are, in a sense, richer, but they have kind of a blue-collar or working-class ethos to them. So social class is partly about a perception or a decision to identify or affiliate with particular groups and values. So the point is occupations, regardless of what those occupations earn, a profession is a certain type of occupation, a trade is a different type of occupation, and it can be independent of what they earn, and it can be independent of what culture that you come out of. But it might generate similar values, interests, and behaviors, and that's why it's interesting to us from a marketing perspective. So this just shows you kind of a different way and kind of some percentages. One thing about the United States is that most people like to classify themselves as middle class. And middle class usually is a lumping together of what is middle class and working class here. So if you think of that, that's almost about 80% of the population thinks of themselves as middle class. Now, and so the point is 80% of the population can't be middle class. If I had look at this just in terms of like income and or wealth, probably about, if you make $300,000, I mean, maybe a better way to say it, we live in the suburbs of New York City. Um, Almost everyone, like the average income for the nation is around $50,000. It's about $80,000 in Yorktown. So the average in this area is much higher than the average for the country. If you took the income of most people in northern Westchester, which is not considered, a crazy wealthy part of the county, you would be wealthy by most standards almost everywhere else in the country. So part of this is who you're comparing yourself to. Northern Westchester compares itself to Southern Westchester, and therefore maybe sees itself as being more middle class or poor in comparison. But if you would compare them to, I don't know, suburbs of Buffalo, New York, or Ohio, many people would certainly objectively be considered wealthy. But the key thing here is that most people in America like to see themselves as middle class, even if they're not middle class, which means anyone who has a job generally sees them as middle class, even if you could say they're objectively poor. And a lot of people who are in the top 1%, i.e. making $300,000, $350,000 or more a year, still will see themselves as a middle class. And part of this is because what people associate with being rich is not having to work, which means the idea of inheriting money or living off your investments or having a certain sized house or having people work for you is what defines someone as rich. So someone who has a very large income, but someone still has to go to work 5 days a week, generally sees them as middle class because they see their income as being earned, even though their income is much larger than most other people's. So what I'm trying to get at here is that social class is partially a perception and partially something that's determined relative to whatever your reference group is, rather than an objective number about how much money or how many assets your family or your family unit holds. So another one is social factors. And so these are more about what social networks you are. And all of this has to be who you hang out with, what types of music you listen to, what schools you go to, what groups you aspire to become part of. And generally, there are people in these groups that are what we call opinion leaders, which means that probably the better term today is an influencer. So someone on YouTube that a lot of people follow and puts out opinions about products, puts out opinions about social and political events, and therefore influences or signals to people like what is a proper view for our group on this topic or this product. These influencers or opinion leaders basically work through that social network. And anyone who has seen the movie The Social Network or understands how social media platforms like Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, etc., work, I think this is pretty intuitive about what they're trying to do here. So what a lot of marketers are doing is that if we can get an opinion leader to plug the product or to advertise the product or use it on their platform, even if they're not, let's say, giving it a straight endorsement, this can, in a sense, get the word out there and can influence or make their product more favorable within a particular social network. So one of these things is what's called a brand ambassador. So someone who really, really likes a particular product, and even someone who's not paid for it, can kind of be kind of a brand ambassador because they kind of say, look, I like this particular product. In my family, everyone drives a Toyota car. And it's almost like, what other type of car would you buy? And because we've had a good experience with them. And a lot of it's because the very first used car that my parents owned way, way back when was a Toyota. And so every single child in the family, even when they grew up, bought a Toyota. And that includes my brother who has a $500,000 bonus every year, drives a Toyota. And my poorest sibling also drives a Toyota because they just see that as the car that everyone they know buys. And a lot of that has to do with the idea of a brand ambassador. Someone in your social network has a certain product, uses a certain product. Another one of this might be is like a certain guitar, like a Fender guitar. Like, what guitar does my favorite band use or play with? And therefore, I associate that with quality, and then I'm going to buy that product even if it's very expensive. My in-laws are from Texas, and they take grilling and barbecuing very seriously. And so they would only buy a Weber grill, W-E-B-E-R, even though those are 4 or 5 times more expensive than, let's say, the standard grill that seems to be about the same quality. And so if you go into Home Depot, there is kind of people who are brand ambassadors can advertise them as people who take this seriously, generally will favor a particular brand or product that they associate with quality. Um, in some cases, these people are paid to be brand ambassadors. Um, Way back when Starbucks was starting, various tech companies would pay people just to hang out at a Starbucks and use their products. So they would give them like a Microsoft Surface, so they would give them, let's say, the early iPad, and just hang out and use it. And by using it in a very public way, in a public environment, like in the lounge at a Starbucks, was a way of let's advertising that product. Um, Now, you were just thought you were just seeing someone, just a regular person, just using a product, and kind of demonstrating its functionality, not knowing that these people were paid. And I had a student, gosh, almost 20 years ago, whose job really is to blog and to write and to use Microsoft products. Um, and that is what she does as a living. Um, and it's something that she really liked the product. People noticed how much she was using it. She wrote some reviews online on her personal blog, and the company saw that and then kind of said, look, would you like to do this for a living? So a question here, just for thought, is that in some ways the idea of a brand ambassador is that they're not being paid for it, so they're kind of like a non-celebrity, non-expert endorsement, like the average person endorsement. Um, would it change your mind if you knew they were being paid? So as I said, in Starbucks, they were paying people to use various tech devices, even though they seem to be ordinary people just going about their business. Your opinion of the product might change if you know they were paid to do something. In the same way that a celebrity or like a celebrity athlete who was using a particular, let's say, sneaker or a particular sporting apparel, if they actually use that in their everyday life, that might be a better endorsement than if Nike or Adidas writes them a very large check to endorse their sneaker product. Some other social factors. Creating a social network. So very often when you see marketers is they create social networks for people to describe how they're using their product, and to interact with their consumers, to create kind of like a buzz for their brand. So they might have like almost like a fan club for various different products, or for a group of people that might, in a sense, use their products more than others. So it could be a group of mothers, it could be a group of adolescent teenagers, etc. And in a sense, bring their ideal customers together and interacting, and then to drop their messages into that stream as a way of getting it into the social network. So another way to do that is to kind of create the viral video, and this is an example of Blendtec that made assorted blenders, and obviously blenders are for food, but they made a will it blend video, which means it would take things like that are not food, golf balls, marbles, silly putty, iPhones, and put them into blenders and just say, will it blend? And a lot of this was kind of almost like, kind of, I don't know, something that people do destructively. But the point about it is the coolness factor, like, I wonder what would happen if you drop like an iPhone in a blender. It gets people to see, and then what it does, it promotes the particular blender they're using, and their blender they're using, and this leads to an increase in sales behaviors because people are seeing their product, even if it's not being in their actual intended use. People at least know the brand name of the product, and therefore they're more likely to demand that from retailers and wholesalers. So some other social factors, family. So there's, as I said, gender stereotypes about certain male versus female, particularly about buying certain products. I mentioned before that stereotypically technology products, power tools, Home Depot, building products, were generally considered things that men make the final decision on because they're the experts on it. This is really not true, but the point is that there was a perception on that. While women over things like towels or food or kitchen items, they would get the final word. And then there's things like kids, so things about entertainment, games, colors on the car, outdoor products. And what you find is that because there are different roles in the family, what marketers will want to do is target different members of the family with their appeals to buy their product. These things are changing as gender roles are changing, as families are changing. We've talked before that, the two-parent plus children nuclear family is not necessarily the norm anymore. And as families change, you're going to see marketers change to kind of keep up with the changing social environment that they're working in. So just to some words that'll be thrown around. A role is kind of something you're expected to do, that people have a different gender role, i.e. that father buys the next does the shopping and does the research for the next TV, while mother does the shopping for the next refrigerator. Status is more about the the esteem given to the role in society, so that if something like mother versus father and the gender balance is considered more esteemed, or the role is more esteemed, this can lead to different types of behavior. So now what you're seeing though is that, and it's just kind of showing that these things are changing, is that men used to do almost none of the grocery shopping. Now about 65% of men, it's not 65% of the grocery shopping is done by men, but 65% of men do shop for groceries, which means for things like shampoo, for things like cauliflower, for things like creamed corn, you'll see appeals more toward both genders rather than only to female, which would have been the trend in the past. And what you're seeing is that women are having a lot of influence over new technology buys, and so, if you think of like men in power tools, and that this is a very male, high testosterone product, that's not true as it was in the past. And you're seeing this thing, in terms of Home Depot, where it was the other day, you're seeing a lot of different, just the colors of power tools, I think, to appeal toward women, and just even some of the shaping, while greasy, dirty, ugly, functional is not as important as before. Just like you have to look good using a tool or a power tool in a way that it wouldn't have been in past. And you can see like some basic design aspects and the things that are mostly functional, like, I don't know, like a weed whacker or a hedge trimmer. There's a lot more things in that, where they're designing the shape and the look of the product, which is bound to get dirty and destroyed. The point is that there seem to be appealing beyond, let's say, the male user of the past. So other things that can affect change over time are like age and life cycle, meaning that people buy certain things when they're young, other things when they're older. People buy a lot of pharmaceuticals when they're older. People buy a lot of toys when they're young. Occupation, different clothing for different types of occupations. For the nurses, you'll see clothing stores that comfortable shoes, targeted nurses, people are on their feet all day, versus things that are comfortable. So if you are working with small children in elementary school, you'll dress a lot more comfortably because you're going to be a lot more active, while a high school teacher might dress more like a college professor, in a sense, a little more formal. So lastly, lifestyle, which means a lifestyle is not so much about income, class, or subculture. It's about a choice of how you live and what things are important to you. So this is more about active versus laid back. People spend most of their time inside versus outside. And generally we call these psychographics. And this is to different than demographics, which might look at objective things like how old you are, gender differences, ethnic differences, etc. Psychographics are about different groups, about what people like or how people behave. And generally we do this by, like you might think of people who plan versus people who don't plan. People who spend a lot of time online versus people who don't spend a lot of time on their line. And these are not, let's say, they don't always fit into clear demographic groups. So what you try to often see, and what you see often with personal factors in these subcultures and lifestyles, is that they very often are tied to zip codes. That there are differences in zip codes. If you look at just our zip codes in our area, there are differences between Mohegan Lake, Shrub Oak, Amawalk, Mayapack, Cortland Manor, Crom Pond, Yorktown, Yorktown Heights. And there's small differences and subtle differences about how people live, how large your house is, whether you want something that's an older house versus a newer house. And what this is showing here, Versonix 21, is one that kind of lets see what kind of things, like a lot of this is like if you buy one product, what other products you're likely to buy. and so they might kind of group you into lifestyle groups by kind of what basket of products you're purchasing. Um, Another thing about this is that they're not, the idea that they're not just buying a physical product, the products have to match and go together. So for example, this is the whole idea of an outdoor kind of skiing, snow, etc. Um, and the idea that you want all your clothes to match and to kind of fit in, even if you're not going sledding, snowing, skiing, etc., that you're dressed like you might be, even though you live, let's say, in the Southwest. And so you want a boot that looks rugged. So you can see like the matching of like and clothing lines between indoor, outdoor, fashionable, unfashionable, things that are more active versus more passive or more sedentary lifestyles, things of that sort. Because you're selling and another probably the best example of people who drive SUVs to commute to work. SUV is basically a truck a car on a truck chassis. And so the idea is that it's really a vehicle designed for going in rough, rural terrain, but people are using it to go in suburban environments from parking lot to parking lot on major highways. But the idea there's something about someone who drives a truck versus someone who drives an SUV versus someone who drives a sedan, and it's partly kind of speaks to the person's lifestyle choices. So personality is more about things that make everyone very different. We talked about this a little bit when we did the case study on the Porsche driver. People who like to drive cars. That part of the attractiveness of a Porsche is that it's difficult to drive, and therefore you have to have a serious person who really understands driving to be able to use it. And the personalities of different brands, and we'll get more into branding later on in subsequent units. But just think about what we were saying before in a previous unit, we talked about monopoly and monopolistic competition about Ford versus GM and Coca-Cola versus Pepsi. So motivation, once again, I think this kind of speaks for itself, is that motivation is a pressing need to seek a particular type of satisfaction. So we talked about this a little bit when we talked about GM brands, that basically what a sports car is a small car with an oversized engine. And this generally targeted baby boomers and particularly people going through midlife crises, because it's a lot of power for a small car. It doesn't mean that everyone who buys a car this way, but that can be a motivation for buying a particular product that might not fit in other things. In my own family, as I'm having our first child and now second child on its way, we have a motivation to go get an SUV van. And so we are looking to trade in our cars that have been very functional, useful for us, for one that can have 2 adults, 2 children, and 2 dogs in it. And generally our current cars don't serve that purpose. But that might be like a motivation. So one way of looking at this is what something called Abraham Maslow was a psychologist, and he basically had the system what's called the hierarchy of needs, which means that when you have certain types of deprivation, you don't focus on higher needs because you just don't have the time. So for example, if you are hungry or thirsty or without shelter, you don't have physiological needs for survival, you don't think about what's the meaning of the universe. When you are alone or deprived of social or interaction with other people, your social needs are not being met, you don't care about your esteem needs. And so the hierarchy of needs says that you need to satisfy the lower needs first, the base of the pyramid, and once those are satisfied, you kind of then focus on higher products that might serve higher needs. Now Maslow wasn't really talking about marketing products, but a way of thinking about this is that people who lived through the Great Depression focus on safety and physiological needs because they experience scarcity and deprivation, while people who grew up during the baby boom and the affluent society of the 1960s, there's a lot more about what's the meaning of the universe, enlightenment, personal fulfillment, higher level self-realization experiences, climbing mountains not to get somewhere, but climbing a mountain just to have the experience of standing on top of the mountain might be something that's more about esteem and self-actualization, while someone who's focusing more on safety and physiological needs just says what's the quickest way to get from one place to another. It shouldn't be difficult, I just want to get there quickly. So think of it in this terms, like there's a lot of people who go rafting or outdoors for camping. There's some people who do it because they don't have an alternative. That's survival. They're buying cheap land. Other people are doing it because they have the free time and they want to, to do hard things on purpose just to have the experience of a hard thing. So near where I am, there's a thing called the Spartan race, which is an grueling mud Ironman type of race that people do by choice. If this makes no sense if you're focused on, let's say, making yourself more comfortable, fulfilling your basic needs, why would you pay someone hundreds of dollars to enter a race that is bloody, dirty, dangerous, people break, arms, legs, etc. The idea is that people want to have that experience of toughing it or roughing it. And this fits into what Maslow was talking about, is that you want that because there's an esteem, i.e. I did something really hard, or a self-actualization, I found the limits of what I can do. So perception is another aspect of this, and perception just means that people do not respond to an objective reality. People respond to a perceived reality, which means that sometimes people are selective. They pay attention to some things more than others. They also sometimes distort things, which means that some things will be clear and focused, and some things will be deliberately misunderstood. And there's also a limit to how much people can process. So one example of this is Times Square in New York City, and you see a lot of different ads. Okay, there's Maxell, there's Vornado, Virgin, Planet Hollywood, Panasonic, Prudential, etc. There's way too much for you to process, and so your mind has to do something about cutting down this information and focusing on certain things over others. So perception is always selective. So what your eye focuses on is different for different people. So someone might notice a Coca-Cola ad on the Times Square building on the left. Someone else might see the Virgin over here on the right. Other people might go the Maxell straight ahead. Or other people might see the McDonald's if you're hungry. So selective attention just means that people can't pay attention to all the information they're getting. And so they have to do something to cull down the information to focus on certain things over on others. So part of this is, what you might call learning. And learning isn't just about school. Learning is about a change in behavior based upon experience, which means based upon something you've done or something, that information you're taking in, your behavior changes from your pattern of behavior changes from a previous pattern of behavior. So this can be because of stimuli, cues, responses, things you're seeing in your environment. So once again, about perception, if you perceive environment to be dangerous, you are going to avoid that environment. If you perceive an environment to be nurturing, you might, in a sense, gravitate toward that environment. But the point is that you were changing your behavior based on a change in perception. So some other just terms. A belief is, a thought that someone has about something. Like, I believe that Fuse is a health drink. That it's good for my body. It has certain nutrients or things in it, even though I don't know what those are. And you can see that antioxidants, most people can't tell you what antioxidants are, but people think antioxidants must mean it's healthy. Just kind of compare this to an attitude. An attitude is more about positive or negative evaluations of something. So someone might look at Fuse and say, hey, that looks like something I might try. Other person sees it and goes, it looks too kind of fruity for me. So people have beliefs, which is more about a statement of fact about something, and an attitude is more about what opinion you have about something. So someone might have the same beliefs but have a different attitude towards something, which means we both might say, okay, Fuse has antioxidants in it. One person might think that is a good thing, another person might think that is a bad thing. So going into the buyer decision process, we can go through, conceive of 5 different stages here. The first one is a recognition of a need, we need to have something, and then what that prompts is a search, okay, I need this, what is out there that can fit this? So for example, you need an N95 mask, okay? You might say, where can I get one? You might look at drugstores, pharmacies, retail stores like Walmart, hardware stores like Home Depot, and you do a search about what are the different quality and masks, 3M is one quality, CVS antiviral mask is another quality, et cetera, et cetera. And then you start to evaluate the alternatives. So you might look at things like price, quality, where it's made, what the functionality of the different products are. And then you make a decision to buy or not buy a product. And then lastly, based upon your use of the product, you might decide to repurchase it. You might decide to change to a different product. You might have a negative reaction to a product or a firm based upon the quality or, let's say, the follow-up on it. And that can matter too. So going through some of these stages, need recognition and information search. A need is triggered by an internal external stimuli, which means either that I'm hungry, I want to eat something, might be an internal stimuli, or an external stimuli. I see this little ad for Pepperidge Farm Milano cookies, and even though I wasn't hungry, yeah, I want to buy that. So advertising very often can change your focus onto certain things. And there's a lot of actually research on snacking, which is that if snacks are not available, most people will not snack or need to buy something. But when people have snacks available, they tend to eat more than they wanted to. And this is what's called an availability heuristic, which means when something is in front of us, it presents itself as a solution to our problem, or might think, oh, I can see that, like, the best example of this is impulse purchases in the checkout line, where you have candy, magazines, etc. Very often, no one goes into the store planning to buy one of those things, but while you're standing in line, you see 5 different types of mint, gum, etc. You see a story on the Inquirer or Us Weekly, and you might think, oh, I need to buy that magazine because I want to read that story. And therefore, the need is created by the advertisement as opposed to something that is internal, like I'm hungry, therefore I'm going to go buy food. So once you have a need, you're going to look at alternatives. So you might consult your friends, like what type of TV do you want? What type of video game, etc. You might look at commercial sources. You might go online and Google search different comments, or go to Consumer Reports and you get different ratings of different products. There are public sources. So, for example, you might get a rating that has some government agency might say this is an Energy Star, energy efficient appliance, and that might be something that is meaningful to you. But you can also have your own experience, which means I had a very bad experience with Apple products back in the 1980s. As a result, despite that almost everyone around me buys some type of Apple products, whether a tablet or a phone, I will refuse to buy it even if someone purchased it for me and it didn't cost me anything. So the point is, I might consult my own experience dealing with the product, or frankly dealing with the people who have bought the product, and maybe whether I like or dislike that group of people. So once we have the information about what's out there in the market, what's available, we're going to evaluate. So we're going to look at the pluses and minuses of different products. We're going to decide like how much money we have, and then we're going to decide, what do we favor and what do we don't favor. So several things that can affect our purchase decision is, whether there's all situational factors like, I don't know, a pandemic. Can be a situational factor that might interfere with our decision. Things that prevent us from doing what we want, a loss of income, a loss of a change in job, a geographical move, a change in relationship. So let's say a divorce or a breakup in a relationship. And the other thing is attitudes of others. And I'll just give you one example just in terms of like college choices, is that when I applied to grad school, like my first choice school was the University of Michigan. I went there for summer camp. I was very loyal. I still follow the University of Michigan to this day in terms of sports and NCAA teams. But when I applied to graduate school, I applied to a variety of different graduate schools, and one of them was Harvard. And the thing is, I got into Harvard, I got into Michigan. Michigan was my first choice. My choice should have been obvious. I put a lot of thought into this decision. I compared the different programs. But every single person I asked, my parents, my friends, my teachers, etc., the people who wrote the recommendation letters for me said, you should go to Harvard. And that's ended up what I did. And the point is that the attitudes of others influenced my own decision, because it made me second guess what I kind of went to in my objective, isolated decision before I knew what was available. Now, that comes to a post-purchase behavior, which is that this turned out not to be a very good decision for me. I actually think my life would have been different, maybe better, if I had gone to a different school, a graduate school. And so what people often have is regret after they purchase something. So you see this sometimes, whether when you're in a restaurant, people provide like a free mint to kind of influence, let's say, what tip you're going to give them, or sometimes on a checkout line in a grocery store, you purchase a lot of things. Some of those things are impulse and maybe wasteful. So they ask you to, you might feel better about it if you make a donation to some type of charity, whether it's a food bank or a children's hospital or things of that sort. But basically, you evaluate the performance of the product versus your expectations of the product. So if the performance is less than what your expectations are, you're going to be disappointed. So the point is, you went in thinking it was going to be a 10 and it turned out to be an 8. Now 8 is not bad on a scale from 1 to 10, but it's not what you expected it to be. You're satisfied if you thought it was going to be an 8 and it turned out to be an 8. Or maybe a different one, you expected it to be a 3 and it turned out to be a 3. It is what you thought it was going to be. You're satisfied with your decision. Now, the last one is that when the performance is much greater than the expectation, you thought it was going to be a 3, it turns out to be a 10. You're probably going to be delighted because you have, let's say, an unexpected bargain. So maybe you're going into a restaurant and you didn't expect very much because it didn't look, you thought, hey, look, this is just what's available. Let's try something new. And it turns out to be your favorite restaurant, and it's much better than you thought it was going to be, particularly on the prices on their menu. And that might say, look, I'm really happy with this. I'm going to come back. One part of the post-purchase behavior that's important is cognitive dissonance. And this is cognitive dissonance comes from a theory by a psychologist named Leon Festinger, is that when you have two contradictory ideas in your mind and you hold them together. And so what Festinger was studying cult behaviors of cults that were predicting the end of the world and trying to see what happens to the cult members after the end of the world didn't happen. So the idea is that they believe this really strongly because they're members of a cult, but at the same time they perceive objective reality, and the prediction made by the cult that the world would end on a particular day didn't happen. And so he coined this term cognitive dissonance to talk about kind of this conflict between two ideas you're trying to have in your mind and how you are going to resolve it. Where this is important for a buyer decision is that when you buy something, you want it to work out. You want it to be good because you purchased it, that was your choice. If it doesn't work, and you might rationalize and try to defend your choice even if it turns out to be a bad choice, which means you don't want to admit that you were wrong or you made a poor decision, and therefore you might, let's say, defend your choice even as you are experiencing, let's say, disappointment in the choice of the product you purchased. So we're going to get to our last thing, which are stages in the adoption process. And this is, adoption means where you have a product that is a new product that people don't really have a reputation for, people don't even know if they're going to use it, and what stages they go through. So the first thing is that people have to be aware of a product. So very often if you have a new product, a lot of the advertising, a lot of the marketing surrounded it is just making people aware that this product exists. A good example of this is the original iPod. The idea that people were going to have songs that had one button, it didn't look like anything that existed before. So you're going to have a small device that, is basically like a little badge that you can put on your pocket. There was a lot of promotion by Apple just to make people aware of it. So they did things like having celebrities endorse it or having celebrities use it. They bought a Super Bowl ad that was, I believe U2 was kind of, it was a U2 song that was using, and there were people dancing to it using the iPod, lots of colors. They really didn't talk about the details of it. They didn't really go into the functionality of it. They just said, look, there's a thing called iPod. And a lot of this also is when people try to get a catchy name for a product, the idea that if you have a catchy name, it'll make people repeat it and easy to remember, and that will raise awareness in it. So once you're aware of a product, you might say, oh, I saw that product, it was advertised, I saw this push ad on my YouTube video that I was watching. I might investigate and look a little more what this is all about. And so you might seek out information to see whether it's a good product. You might see people who purchased it, were they happy or not happy with it. And then you're going to go through that evaluation process. Like, okay, so I've got this information, I looked online, I've decided like how much money I want to spend on it, and you decide whether it's a value to you. And then you might say, okay, I'll try this product. And this is very often where you see free trials, like buy this product, and if you don't like it, 20 days, you can return it. Very often what happens is that people who are on the fence are not going to buy it, but if you give them a free trial, they're willing to try it. And very often what happens when you try something, you forget to return it, or you keep it, or you don't, very often with cable offers, You forget that like the rate is going to be jacked up after 1 year, and people don't like to change because they're busy doing other things. And finally, adoption means people are using it full and making regular use of it, which means something you buy every day, like laundry detergent. You always buy one particular brand of it. It's your go-to thing. You generally, even if a better brand comes up, your loyalty keeps you from considering other products. So I was talking about one thing, and Hyundai has like an insurance program, which means that um, if you don't like your car or if situations change, like you lose your job, lower income, you can give your car back and return it, and it will refund your money. And for people who are worried about, let's say, are they going to be able to afford something, or people are worried that they might not like it, or it's a lot of money, creating an insurance program is that, saying, look, it's riskless, or we're going to insure your poor choices, and therefore more people are likely to try it, and if they get to the trial stage of the process, they're going to be more likely to adopt it. So kind of just thinking about who are the people, like who adopts the products, like the innovators are the people who adopted it well before other people. So if you think of like Tesla, people who are driving electric cars, right now these are innovators or people who have it when no one else has it. Early adopters is as this product becomes more common, they are the people who are willing to like spend over the market price to buy the product. And then you have, let's say, it becomes a common product. You see the majority will start to buy the product. And then lastly, there are people who are laggards. So if we think of it in terms of smartphones, my father is a great example of a laggard. He had a flip phone until about a year ago when he realized that a flip phone was not functional for some things he wanted to do, and spent 10 years saying, I'm not going to buy a phone, I'm not going to buy this phone because it's not worth it, et cetera, despite having the resources and despite the fact that it would make his life easier. While there are people like my sister Maria, who was an innovator, who had a smartphone well before most people even purchased one because she was very clued in to that market at that time of her life. So, what can influence the rate of adoption? One can be whether the product is significantly better than existing products. So, um, one thing about smartphones is that are they as good as a camera? No. Are they as good as a landline phone? At least the early ones? No. But if you give me, let's say, 80% of a camera and 80% of a phone and put them together in the same product, that might be superior to the existing, standalone phone, standalone camera. Is it compatible? And this is a big thing with computers is that you have to be able to run the software that previously exists, or you have to be able to, people want to keep their files, they don't want to change that. So a big thing about this is being able to bring your own phone number as you change, let's say, from one phone or one plan to another. If you can't keep your number, or you can't keep your existing system or other things you've purchased, you're probably going to try to keep things that are compatible or things that are consistent with your earlier purchases rather than buy a better product that is inconsistent. Complexity. If something is hard to understand, if something is hard to learn, even if it's a much better product, it's probably not going to be adopted. And you saw this a lot with, the very famous example is Betamax versus VHS videotapes. Betamax was a much better product. However, the technology to use it was a little more complicated, and so people bought VHS because it was a lot simpler to use, at least for someone who was not technically competent. Divisibility, which means can it be used, like this is the whole idea of a trial thing, which means can I buy it, part of it, instead of buying it the whole, which means if I can buy a trial, if I'm able to lease a car versus buy a car, that might lead to more adoptions because people will get more trial out of it. And lastly is, can you actually understand whether the product works or not? Communicability, which means can other people tell you, like, yes, I use this product works, I'm going to create an endorsement and show you how to use it. So that's where we're going to end for today. We're coming up on 1 hour on this video lecture. And we'll do part 2, and it'll be coming out later.